Look at is Judges 11. I'm trying to move from Hebrew Bible to New Testament. Judges 11. That's the one I mentioned earlier about Jephthah, right? And I want us to think about going beyond, you know, see, we're kind of an oral, A-U-R-A, you know, we're kind of a, when it comes to the church, we do this thing, right? We're oral, and it's this oral, the way we hear things, right? And so we have our prescribed text that we just, when you go to Judges 11, right, we're just going to look at Jephthah's daughter. But what we want to think about is how do we go beyond what we've always heard in our biblical storytelling and in our Sunday morning Bible studies or our Wednesday evening or whenever you all are having your various Bible studies. How do we go beyond the prescribed ways of thinking about these things? And in this essay about family values, it's Dr. Lovelace who talks about, she approaches this text from the perspective on the family that was handed down by the Moynihan report. When you start thinking about policy, this shows how policy influences. So just bringing this other, I'll be sure to take that back to Dr. Lovelace, the man in the house rule, because that's all a part of the same thinking, that families need to look a certain way. And then the outcome of the family, there's no way for that single mother to raise a son who would be a leader in his community, okay? And so the basic feminist commentaries look at Jephthah and his mother as lacking traditional family values. And this is a functionalist argument that Dr. Lovelace presumes here. So that's where Jephthah's daughter is at the end of chapter 11. You see how long this chapter is if you're looking at it here. But we want to focus in on Jephthah's activities and what happened with him and his unnamed single mother in this text. And this argument, this family values argument, goes along the line that children born to single mothers become juvenile delinquents and create social instability, right? This rhetoric targeted mostly at black children. They don't make this argument against all of the single family, white families and children from those families, but it's targeted mostly at black children, and it's the same language used to describe Jephthah, which in turn functions to racialize Jephthah and his mother as black. So even if we don't see any racial commentary in the passage, so you kind of read these passages, that's why the context. So in the ancient world, they may not have necessarily been thinking about all of these appropriations around family values that we see today, but in the interpretive tradition. So when commentaries are written about the text by white interpreters and white feminist interpreters, that's where all of the racializing takes place. So we're going back to the point where context matters. It didn't start out that way. This is a story about Jephthah, who was a leader and had to fight the Ammonites and all of this. But by the time the text takes on a life of its own in these different commentary traditions, we get the negativity around Jephthah's daughter, but we also get the negativity around family values as reflected in the African American community as imposed on us from white policymakers. So these are the different layers of interpretation that come to fore in a womanist hermeneutic. So I'm just earmarking at this point these passages so you can have this for future consideration. And if you actually read the essays, you'll see how these critics were able to weave the ancient with the contemporary, honoring both contexts though. but raising critical questions for how we move forward today. Okay? And this whole language about thugs and the assumptions made about young black men and how they dress and all of that. We can't even wear hoodies and be safe. You know, I'm talking about my 2 teen boys now. We moved into a new community, and mostly a white community, right? And so we have our little listserv, and every time they saw some suspect black person, they were sending out a message on the listserv. I said, ooh, I better take my boys around, and we need to start jogging, and I need to let these people see, because those of my 2 sons fit all the descriptions that were coming through on the listserv. And we live there. Okay, sounds familiar, right? So this is the struggle, going back to the notion of struggle. Not that we love struggle, but the struggle is just there. Just coming home and reading the email messages on the community listserv is another moment to have to advocate for your children. It never ends, and we must remain vigilant in this. Okay, so I want to take you to Acts 12. We're pushing in on the quarter to noon hour. I want us to just survey some of these texts, just so you can see. Acts 12, because these are texts that are just embedded in our scriptures, right, that we glance right over. Acts 12, another one of these pretty lengthy passages. Peter and delivers this speech from prison, but it's around verse 12, right? Rhoda. Have you all studied Rhoda? Any here? You all know about Rhoda? Yep. And you can see that she's mentioned as a maid named Rhoda. As soon as he realized, he went to the house of Mary. The house of Mary, you see verse 12? That's saying a lot right there, okay? So the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many had gathered and were praying. When he knocked at the outer gate, a maid named Rhoda came to answer. On receiving Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed that instead of opening the gate, she ran in and announced that Peter was standing at the gate. They said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she insisted that it was so. They said, "It is an angel." And meanwhile, Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the gate, they saw him and were amazed. He motioned to them with his hand to be silent and described for them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he added, "Tell this to James and to the believers." Then he left and went to another place. So it's right in there where Dr. Amer examines the enslaved girl. So she was actually enslaved in this text, Rhoda. And she reads this passage with intersectionality at hand. So she reads it darkly, and she allows Rhoda to speak. Amer's womanist reading of Rhoda attends to the issues of trauma arising from the darkness of the intersectional oppression that's based on her ethnocentrism, based on sexism, classism, and ageism, considering Rhoda's youth. And what we find here is that Amer is able to raise questions around forced migration and human trafficking in this text, and gives Rhoda a voice that would be often unheard and more so misunderstood. And then finally, I want to take you to Luke in terms of biblical text. Luke 18, and that's verses 15 to 17. And this is where Jesus blesses the little children. And we tend to still read this as children who are old enough or big enough to be like 12-year-old. When you read this, who would you think of? Like 10, 12 years old, whatever, you know. We're thinking of children who are able to just come running to Jesus and, you know, the children's sermon kind of thing. You know, we have that image of this text. And what Bridget Green does in this text is to interpret this passage through the civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer. And she's looking at gender, class, and race analysis and all of the power dynamics inherent in this text. And using the speech, nobody's free until everybody's free. So Green introduces Hamer in this chapter of the book to actually bring, you wouldn't think about bringing nobody's free until everybody's free in dialogue with the passage about Jesus and the children here. But this was a message delivered at the founding meeting of the National Women's Political Caucus. And this is the hermeneutical lens that is the wedge that opens this passage up. And Green is able to see the advocacy of women in this text in the same way that Hamer and others of the civil rights movement were advocates for those who were not able to speak for themselves. And so these are some of the texts that show you how the womanist hermeneutic comes to fore. It's a matter of identifying what's marginalized, what's left out, the experiences that we don't tend to think about, and the texts that are embedded in these large chapters in our biblical narratives. Now, there's one more text I have listed here that I want to share with you, and this is a text beyond the Bible. It's a Acts of Paul Ethiopic text. And this is where I'm going to share a bit about my own scholarship that looks at Ethiopic or Ge'ez sources. And I'll put that up here. Ge'ez. That's ancient Ethiopic. We know Amharic is the modern version of Ethiopic that is spoken today. But within the church tradition, Ge'ez was the language spoken within the Aksumite Empire. And so my particular essay deals with black collectors and keepers of tradition, resources for a womanist biblical ethic of reinterpretation. And in that essay, I talk about the Tweed collection of Ethiopic artifacts and manuscripts that we own at the Howard University School of Divinity. I also talk about the importance of transgressing the canon. We tend to think that all of our resources are just within the Old Testament and the New Testament, but in the Africana experience, there are other sources that we can have access to. So transgressing canonical boundaries and overcoming what's known as structured academic amnesia. All right, that's a phrase that Katie Cannon coined, and I love to use it because the academy is set up as if we really didn't exist. And our stories certainly don't matter. That's that structured academic amnesia. And if we don't continue to tell our stories and reassert who we are within the academy and who we have been throughout the Christian tradition, our stories will be lost. And so I focus on these black bibliophiles, Arthur Schomburg, Jesse Moreland, Arthur Spingarn. We know the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University, Dorothy Porter Wesley, who was instrumental in pulling that center together, Charles Wright. All of these are black bibliophiles. And when I say black bibliophiles, I'm talking about collectors. These are African Americans who had resources to travel and collect manuscripts and artifacts from Africa. And you can see the last name there in bold, Andre Reynolds Tweed. He was the physician who donated his collection of Ethiopic manuscripts and artifacts to the School of Divinity back in 1993. So once again, I'm taking you back. This is not new material, and maybe some of you who've been in this area have already heard about the Tweed collection. Can I get a show of hands? Yes. So it's important that we remember that we have these resources of 150 manuscripts that bear witness to the Christian religious experience in ancient Ethiopia, as well as 240 artifacts. And so my scholarship specifically focuses on this Tweed collection. I learned about a text, the Acts of Paul, in my research long before I had relocated to Washington, D.C. I was doing research on Ethiopians and blacks in the Bible. And as I went about talking and sharing this material, folks in different audiences would ask me, well, what were the Ethiopians doing? What kinds of resources do we have from Ethiopia? How do we learn about the Ethiopian Christian experience? And I was not able to answer those questions because all of the sources I had been working with were Greek and Latin sources, right? We're going back to the academy and how things are structured so that certain stories are told and other stories are left out altogether. So when I learned about the Tweed collection, I started a research project that deals with the Aksumite Empire. And so this is transgressing the canon. So that's what I want to leave you with today. We have all of these biblical sources and examples, but we have even other sources that come from Ethiopia that represent our own African experience and African way of being people of faith. And the problem is we don't have a chance to hear about the Aksumite Empire, right? We know about the Roman Empire, for those of you who studied, right? Jesus, you know, he was a threat to Rome. So we know every way that Jesus was a threat to Rome, and we know all of the missionary activities of Paul around the Mediterranean. But little do we know of the activity in Nubia and the activity of the Christians along the Nile River and around the Red Sea, okay? So that's where we want to, so once we open up to this hermeneutic, then we're free to actually explore our own stories and our own traditions and go back to understanding our origins and beginnings, not from the slave experience when Christianity was forced upon us, and you heard Howard Thurman's grandmother talk about what that was like. That certainly couldn't have been our starting point, right? A master telling you that you're supposed to be obedient to, you know, and accept being a good and happy slave. No, that don't even, it didn't sound right to us back then. Thurman's grandma knew that that wasn't right. And we know it's not right today, but we're locked in a paradigm of interpretation that comes from the academy, and those of us who lead and teach in the church, being good students that we were and are, we bring that same paradigm to the church today. And unless we are equipped to go beyond what we have been taught, and our professors meant well, but they could only do what they could do. Right, Dr. Fentress Williams? Yeah, okay, some of them, yeah. So we're in a season now with the leadership that you have here and the leadership throughout this country. I mean, they're phenomenal leaders, religious leaders in our country today. And we're called to take our teachings and our preaching to a new level. And so I want to invite us to consider the African origins of Christianity. Northeast Africa, that's a map of Ethiopia. I'm going to just kind of run through here. I want you to see the Ge'ez script, right? 26 letters there. This is 2 parts of the slide. But in order for me to continue being relevant in my own scholarship, I heard someone ask about policies and wars, and that's not, this is what I do. I'm one of these boring biblical scholars who loves languages. And language is that litmus test. It's the gatekeeper. That's the gatekeeper. If you can read and speak the language, you have the power to redefine the interpretation. That's what this thing is about. That's why I know where my gifts are and my priorities. And so I invite you to find your gifts and your priorities and hone in on the language world of your particular area of expertise. So I want to model that for you all. I'm not trying to be everything to everybody. I can't do all of that. One person, 2 teenage sons. That's enough. That's the full-time job right there. But I have to pay the bills, so then we do other things. But this is what I do, and this is my calling, is to share this material. It's so difficult to see this slide here, but the point of the matter is, we at the Howard School of Divinity had an opportunity to actually return this Acts of Paul text back to Ethiopia. And yeah, okay. And we know how many of our museums and universities have all of these ancient African artifacts, and we act like they belong to us. Hello? Right? Now, we were able to trace that we actually have a donation that was made to us from Dr. Tweed, right? So we understand exactly when we received our collection of Ethiopic artifacts and manuscripts. But in my research, I was able to find out that the provenance, and that's what you can't see in the slide here, this term provenance, which actually means origins, or who owns it, the property of. In the slide there, the provenance says Deborah Libanos Monastery in Ethiopia. And I had traveled to the Howard University School of Divinity, and I knew that this manuscript was actually at Howard. So there was a provenance discrepancy. But at that time, when I discovered this about 10 years ago, I'm an outsider from another theological school who had come in to do some research, and I found this discovery, if you will. And basically, when I wrote up the findings from that particular research project, I just bracketed the provenance issue. And later, once I was actually called to serve at Howard as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and also as Professor of New Testament, I was then not an outsider, but actually an insider, and I had the opportunity to help our school to actually repatriate or send the manuscript back to where it belongs. Okay? And so that's an image of the manuscript there. And we had a delegation. And my essay in the volume talks about the leadership involved and the ethical mandate of returning these ancient sources once we discover the rightful owners. And so these are just some of the slides from Ethiopia that show us doing this act of what I call scholarship and an act of goodwill, and building a relationship with our brothers and sisters in Ethiopia. But they had a major ceremony here. And this was 2 years ago when we actually took the manuscript. So when we think about womanist hermeneutics, we don't quite know how it will evolve. I've heard some of your questions today in terms of the possibilities of this. I would have never imagined when I first started on this journey, in the class of Dr. Dolores Williams, and at the feet of Katie Cannon and Renita Weems and Clarice Martin, that I would have the opportunity to continue the journey and to actually be situated right in the midst of where the material is housed and actually have an opportunity to share in setting an example for our colleagues, not only in the academy, but also in ministry, okay? So that's where we are today. We've had a chance to have some dialogue already. I want to call your attention to two opportunities to continue to study and reflect on womanist hermeneutics. There's a conference down at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, in New York City on February 24th. That's honoring the 25th anniversary of the publication of Dolores Williams' book, Sisters in the Wilderness. And there's also a conference in April, all of this is in your packet, at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, that's hosted by Dr. Katie Cannon. That is the inaugural conference for the Center for Womanist Leadership. So when we think about what's the impact, what are the next steps, you'll see the final slide I have in your packet is what are these next steps. So I want you to think about the Center for Womanist Leadership. Think about ways that you can continue to be involved. This is not a one-time conversation. It's an ongoing dialogue. And it will take sustained action for us to continue to infuse this way of being and reading biblical texts into our churches and out into the larger society. So I have just been delighted and blessed to share with you today. I leave that open slide there for you all to complete in terms of next steps, to think about where do we go from here. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank Dr. Stay right here. Yeah. We want to thank Dr. Byron for pouring into us. I just think it's so important to recognize how fortunate we are to have had her for 3 hours today. And I want to encourage you, as you reflect on her work and her contributions, to pray for her. The work that she has done is groundbreaking, and that means it's hard, and that oftentimes you are doing it by yourself or with just a few people or your friends online. When you think of her and you read her book, remember her in prayer, remember her family, and tell her thank you whenever you can. Because right now what's going to happen is we're going to whisk her downstairs, where she will be at a table with her books. You will have an opportunity to greet her. You will have an opportunity to purchase a book if you'd like, or greet her and purchase a book. Those are your three options. We thank you for attending this conference, and God bless you all. All right, we're going to have to strong. Okay.
Takes a little after this. Huh? My brain is full after this. Did you come to the previous one? No, I'd love to. My boys were playing soccer.